Hey, Jeff, have you ever been to Barcelona?
Yes, actually, I have. I've only been once. Beautiful city, love it.
Mhm.
I did back when I was, I don't know, 19 or something like that, 20. I did a 3 month European sort of trip, very stereotypical sort of, early adulthood European backpacking trip thing. And Barcelona was one of the first places I stayed in because
Oh, good.
I flew into Lisbon and then went from Lisbon to passed over Madrid, went to Barcelona. Most people have told me that Madrid's fine, but it's, if you pass it, it's not that big of a deal. I don't know if that holds up. I've never been to Madrid.
Madrid's a great city. I mean, and it's a very, there's a lot going on. But Barcelona has a particular vibe of its own that I think that is attracting to some people. Yeah.
Right. I mean, it was a beautiful city. One of those cities that I would say is there's just no way to get a bad picture of it,
Right. Right.
It's just the architecture is really good. And then, I haven't been to it since, but I did study it quite a bit when I was getting my master's in urban planning because Barcelona has sort of upheld a lot as sort of a uh, what city planning is doing right, right? They have these really big blocks. They're
Yep.
called super blocks. But what they've done is basically at each corner of a large part of their city, they sort of carved out so that the corners are sort of little plazas unto themselves. And that's really cool that it really enables a lot of sort of pedestrian activity and like things to happen and, street seats and all this fun stuff that we don't do so much here inside, the United States, but it's actually something that people generally kind of like to use. So,
Well, some of those urban forms that you're talking about really date back to the 1800s, the mid 1800s. So when that grid was put on top of the city, connecting the old city to cities of Gracia and others, um, they cut off those corners like you were saying, and this was envisioned as sort of a democratic way to lay out a city. They didn't realize all their aspirations, I don't think, but yeah, it's very distinctive for that as well. And I know what you're talking about, that there's a lot of public spaces and things that are
mhm.
held up as examples of good urban planning.
Right. And of course, the Sagrada de Familia. Did I get
That's
that
right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, when I was there, it was still under construction. I think it might still be under
Oh, it's
construction.
still under construction. I don't think the construction is probably not going to finish. I mean, the original plans for that were much more extravagant than what even exists today. We're talking
Yeah,
about the Sagrada Familia, the Sacred Family. This is a cathedral of unique design, designed by Antoni Gaudi. And this is one of the distinctive landmarks in the city.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you almost, at this point, it's kind of like you almost go there to see it under construction.
Yeah,
It's
there's
like,
always
it's such a
cranes
part of
up.
the story.
There's always cranes up. Yeah. And I think it's privately funded, the construction now. So we're talking about Barcelona, but when you were in Barcelona, how aware were you of the idea that you were in Catalonia?
At that point, again, I was pretty young. I was vaguely aware that there was a different language. I had
Mhm.
done sort of research on each location I was going to, so I sort of knew what's what. And that was one of the things that stood out to me. It's like, okay, they speak Spanish, but that's not the primary language, so to say, right?
Yeah.
Catalonian is, and so one of the things was like had made mention that um, you'll if you know Spanish, you'll be able to get around. If you know Catalonian, obviously you'd be able to get around.
Mhm.
English was a distant third, and probably because they already had two languages that they were sort of doing. So I think that's sort of the context I knew it best in, was sort of the language.
Yeah, well, and it's important to mention the language because it is a language that is separate from Spanish, Castilian Spanish, just as French and Portuguese are separate languages as well. It's that distinct. And it's a very there's a core value held in the
Mm-hmm.
language, and the language and speaking the language is and sometimes interpreted as sort of an act of being Catalan, right? And so even
Right.
if you were to move there from someplace else, if you speak Catalan, you become increasingly apparently accepted into society as somebody who has adopted that
Mm-hmm.
particular view. And certainly people speak Castilian Spanish, but most people who are Catalan prefer to speak Catalan because that's their language. And
Right.
right,
To
makes
me,
sense.
I mean, I'm not trying to match it historically. And obviously, Catalonia has a very deep history, but in some of these language parallels, I often think about Quebec, Canada, because there's a sort of a similar language sort of divide between their relatively small province, Quebec obviously being really big, but within the context of Canada being relatively small part of Canada, but speaking a completely different language and being more accepted and probably more appreciated if you speak French with them rather than English.
Yeah,
That was my experience.
Yeah, it's a platform, a venue for the expression of a distinct identity that's separate from the central identity of the country, and that language is a way of making that clear and of articulating that sort of on a daily basis. So we'll talk about all of these things, and we're getting into the history as well. A couple terms that I'll use now. If you remember way back when we had our second episode, which was a two-parter about what if there were no international borders or boundaries. Remember that?
I do. I remember that. We really came out swinging for this podcast.
Yeah, I know. That was a good one. So we went over a bunch of terminology there. And so, that might be a very interesting follow-up to this one, to anybody who hasn't tuned into that one. But there's a couple terms that I want to use throughout the talk here and in our conversation so that people know exactly what we're talking about. And so the first term is sovereignty. Okay, sovereignty, right. Which is, having complete control over a particular place, territory, right? So,
right. Yeah, you get to determine the laws there. You get to determine sort of, what's, good, what's not good, all that kind of stuff.
Right. Make all the decisions, have an army, coin a currency, all these things. Autonomy is having some control, some political control over a territory, but not complete control. So in the case of the United States, Oregon has some autonomy, right? Like we get to have a sales tax or not. We don't, we can decide to have an income tax or not. We can legalize various things. We can make decisions that don't conflict with the national government and the Constitution, because the United States has sovereignty over the 50 states, Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, Guam, U.S. Virgin Islands. These are all part of U.S. territory. And then there's the idea of a state. So in political geography, when we use the term state, we're not talking about, California or Florida or Texas. We're talking about the United States or Canada or Mexico or China or Brazil or something like that. So states is a country, and the state is the leadership or the offices that make a country function. And there's, of course, people in leadership roles that have to make it function.
Yeah, and then it almost feels like for that state definition, almost feels like that's the government. That's the entity that is, passing laws, that is enforcing laws, that is the bureaucracy almost of this area of land that they have sovereignty over. That's right. And there's the like in the United States and several other places, there's judicial things going on. There's the executive branch, somebody in charge. There's a legislature, which is a little bit separate. And there's variations on that scheme as well. Then there's a nation. Okay.
And a nation is a group of people.
Right.
So it's not a place, it's a group of people. And, some people might say, well, the United States is a nation, but some might say there are many nations in the United States because we have indigenous people, Native Americans, we have people from different parts of the world. Part of the United States used to be part of Mexico. There's all kinds of different things going on. So to say there's one nation might be tricky. And, that's a very political thing as to, who gets to be a nation and who gets to have a state. And there's this idea of nation state, right? And that's the idea that nation and state are the same, basically. Like, there's who lives in France? Well, the French, except that not only the French live in France, there's a bunch of other people who live there as well. So that gets kind of problematic, but that's part of our story today. And then there's nationalism, which is the belief that a place should be, we often think of it as pride in a country or something like that. But a nationalist is also somebody who believes that a particular place should be independent and should be ruled in a particular way. So those are some of the terms we'll probably use, and just to sort of float that out there so we're all on the same page.
Yeah, I think, as you're running through this, in my head, I'm a geographer. I have a lot of sort of geographic background. But in my head, that the thing that gets conflated most with each other is the idea of a country and the idea of a nation, like
Right.
those two, right? The nation of France and the country of France, those two are one and the same. It's like,
Yeah, I think those are
well,
used interchangeably all the
yeah.
time, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the
Right.
popular media, even in academia, but certainly in the popular media.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
And I think that, it's a good call out, especially for given today's, the episode that we're doing today, that, as we talk about Catalonia, as well as maybe some other places that are sort of serve as like examples, that this idea of a nation existing within a country is very much something that exists.
that's right. And I think you've gotten to this point where we want to talk about this in the greater context, right? So we're talking today about Catalonia and the independence movement there, but it's good to keep in mind there's a greater context here, which is this is really just an example of things that are going on all over the world. And they're all a little bit different, but they have some similarities as well. And the similarity is that there's a group of people that identify as a group of people who want to have control over a particular territory and want to have sovereign control and not just autonomous control or no control. So can you think of some examples that come to your mind when I say independence movement? What do you think of?
The very first one that comes to my mind, and it might just be because they're both located in the same geographic region of the world, but the first one that comes to my mind is Scotland.
Okay.
Which has had, and the reason why is because I think there's some parallels, and maybe we'll get to this sort of later in the episode, but just based on the timeline, it wasn't that long ago, I want to say maybe 2014 to 2016, that Scotland was having its own referendums, internal referendums about independence and saying, we want to break free from the United Kingdom because they feel that they're disproportionately sort of not represented compared to England, which does have a much larger population and all this kind of stuff. So that was the first one that sort of popped into my head, which could probably serve as its own episode too at some point.
It would have to be its own episode. And fitting, today we're talking about Catalonia. To do it in one episode is tough because there's a lot to say, but that's what we do. We try to distill things down. We do a deep dive, but we still only have a little over an hour to talk about these things.
Yeah. The other one that I thought of, and this is just because I just brought them up as an example, is Quebec, Canada, right. Which, I don't know the exact date, but I know they had a referendum maybe in the 80s or the 90s.
I think it was in the 90s. I think, and it was narrowly defeated.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's interesting because I think the Scotland one was narrowly defeated as well. It would have been interesting to see how Canada and the UK would have reacted had either of those passed. Here inside the United States, we're 50, sort of autonomous states of sorts, but obviously there was a big civil war that says, no, you can't do that. There's no leaving this, right?
Right.
But it'd be interesting to see how these other countries maybe would have reacted to something similar. And I don't necessarily think that they would have gone the same route as the United States in the mid 1800s, but we don't know.
Right. And not only how, like Canada would react to Quebec, for example, or England and UK and Scotland, but how the rest of the world would react, right? Because to become a country and to be recognized as a country, the venue for that in the world is the United Nations.
Oh, true.
And the sort of guiding principle of the United Nations is territorial integrity, which means, all right, if you have an independent country, you get to decide what goes on in that country. You get to make the decisions, and nobody's supposed to tell you what to do otherwise. Right. That hasn't eliminated war or anything like that, but it's supposed to set some rules for how the international system operates. And so there's one recent example I can think of, fairly recent, of an independence movement that realized a new country, and that's South Sudan.
Oh, right. Yeah, that was just like in 2010 or something like that.
Somewhat recently, I would argue, right? Yeah. And so South Sudan broke apart. There's a very different set of people with different beliefs and different backgrounds in the north and in the south. And there was a civil war that was fought, and that culminated in independence of South Sudan. And there's still conflict there. Kosovo is another place that has declared its independence and has been recognized by a bunch of countries in the world, including the United States, but has not been recognized by the United Nations. And so it's in this fuzzy area, you might say. But depending on who makes a map will determine whether it shows it as independent or if it shows it as part of Serbia still.
Right. The other one that I just popped in my head that's exists inside this gray area would be Taiwan, right?
Right. That's another great example.
I mean, that's a whole other episode. We can't even really begin to touch that because we just wouldn't be doing it justice. But it sort of exists inside that. Well, what exactly is it on the world stage?
And there's other examples. In addition, that's a great example. There's the Kurds, who are a group of people that number some 30 million or something like that are in Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, I think a little bit. And so this is a group that's fighting for independence in multiple countries. They have multiple political parties that don't necessarily all see eye to eye, but they're trying to realize Kurdistan, which would be an independent state for the Kurds. There's Hawaiians, Hawaii used to be a kingdom, right, and it was annexed by the United States, and then it was made a territory, and then it was made a state. And so there's a Hawaiian independence movement. And then in the Iberian Peninsula, in addition to Catalonia, for example, there's the Basque Country, which is a group of people who speak a pre-Indo-European language that's not apparently related to anything else. And there was a militant insurgency that was going on for a while as well, with a group that, according to the Spanish state, was terrorists. And of course, probably from the perspective of Basques, were freedom fighters. It all depends on who you ask. That was staging bombings and trying to activate independent country for the Basque Country as well. There are movements in countries all over the world. Democratic Republic of Congo, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Morocco, Nigeria, China, India, Indonesia, Japan, Myanmar, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Romania, Russia, Canada, Mexico, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, the Marshall Islands, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, Venezuela. This is only a partial list of places. And sometimes there are multiple independence movements happening, particularly in some of the larger countries as well. So as we talk about Catalonia today, let's keep in mind that this is to inform our understanding that this kind of dynamic in altered form happens in places all around the world.
Right.
Let's get into some history though on Catalonia here, and there's a lot of history, and we're taking kind of a historical approach. We often do that, but I think we could have just reviewed what's happened in the last 10 years or something, and we will, and we could have spent a lot of time doing that. But I think providing all of this background is really helpful for people to understand the trajectory of places that want to, and people who are associated with the places that want to be independent.
Right. I mean, we say this all the time, but, and I'm a geographer, but I'm also a big history buff. And I don't think there's anything that we talk about that isn't served by talking about the history first, right? There's so much right. that goes on, 100, 200, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 years ago that still has an impact today and has led to where things are today. And Catalonia is absolutely going to be no different.
History matters, right? Place matters, history matters, time matters. So listener, this would probably be a good time to bust out your atlas and focus on the Mediterranean area and the Iberian Peninsula in particular, where Spain and Portugal are now located, and Catalonia and the Basque Country.
Or if you're watching on YouTube, it's right here on the screen for you.
Oh, we got it. That's right. This is the new style, the innovation
the new style.
That's happening. Yeah. That's right. We're back on YouTube. So exploring the history of places that are seeking independence is important because the contemporary nationalist movements are often built on understandings of the geographic memory of a place, the past of a place. And that's usually evoked in order to say, this is why we need to be independent. In the case of Catalonia, the medieval era from the 11th to the 14th century provides histories, but also mythologies, which inform contemporary understandings of what Catalonia is as a place and why it should be independent. So let's get into the Wayback Machine for just a moment and go back to pre-Roman times in the Iberian Peninsula, where groups of people called the Iberians lived, and including in what is now Catalonia. And this was an area that was conquered by the Romans just over 2,000 years ago. So in Barcelona, and I don't know if you saw them when you were there have been Roman ruins that have been uncovered, unearthed. And, that's sort of evidence of this old version of what went on.
Yeah, I think I did. I mean, to be honest, you go to enough, especially Southern European cities, and, you're going to see a lot of, old Roman ruins.
Right. I mean, the Roman ruins aren't quite as on feature as they might be in some other places. Like It's not the giant aqueducts that you might see in the south of France, for example. And a lot of them are sort of underground, have been unearthed, but this is a tie to the Roman past. And of course, the Roman Empire collapsed in around 400 or 500 and a common era. And then in 1801, the Franks, this is Charlemagne's group, right? Conquered the Muslim-controlled city of Barcelona and established something called the County of Barcelona. So this is a political entity that we see happening and emerging in 801. And then in 988, the Count of Barcelona breaks from allegiance from the King of France, and a feudal regime independent of the French king is established by the 11th century by Ramon Berenguer. And the Count of Barcelona, who becomes the Count of Barcelona. So this is, again, a period that people today can point to. It's like, all right, so this is the origins of this independent place that we might call Catalonia. By the middle of the 11th century, Catalonia emerged as a maritime power supported by both a commercial and military fleet in the Mediterranean. It marked the beginning of an era in which Catalonia enjoyed the status of one of the great powers of the time at the Mediterranean, competing with places like Genoa and Venice, right?
This feels like it's lining up with the time of, I feel like there was a time in Europe when city-states were becoming very powerful unto themselves. I'm thinking like Venice, for example,
right?
Which didn't control that much territory. I mean, it had a little some, but it was through the power of sort of the maritime aspect of it and the trade, it was able to influence and control a lot of wealth around, well, what was then the known world of the Mediterranean and Europe broadly.
That's exactly right. So the countries of the world and of Europe didn't exist back then the way they do today. And there were a lot of smaller municipalities and kingdoms and various things. And as you're suggesting, some of them were very powerful in the mercantile world. And this also marks a transition, which is a transition that takes hundreds of years away from the feudalism, to a new economic system called mercantile capitalism, which predates industrial capitalism. So That's some of the context for that. The conquests throughout the 12th century significantly expanded Catalan territory. And I think I mentioned that. And then we finally get the first written mention of Catalonia and Catalans in the early 12th century, thus marking the emergence of a territorial entity called Catalonia, right? So that goes back that far. However, in the 1100s and 1137, in particular, Catalonia joins in dynastic union with Aragon, not Aragorn, because that would be somebody else, but this is a place called Aragon.
I was going to make that joke.
That's right. Oh, I should have left that open. We can retake it.
Yeah. The king of, Gondor from Lord of the Rings. So not that.
It's not that. It's an actual place that exists not just in our minds.
Yeah, it's still today, right? Still a state or a province in Spain.
It's still a part of Spain today. If you look at Catalan texts, and Catalan historians like to call it the Catalan-Aragonese Confederacy, because this sort of highlights Catalonia's involvement in what's going on. But most of the histories that you'll read in English refer to it as the Kingdom of Aragon. And so under this crown, Catalonia retained its own traditional rights, its own parliament, and Catalonia remains mostly autonomous under this union until the 18th century. So into the 17th.
Oh, a good period of time. That's right. 600 years or something.
Right. So that's important for us to note when we're talking about the contemporary thing, when we get to that, because people will say, well, wait a minute, this place has been independent longer than it's been under the Kingdom of Spain.
Hmm.
And so that's the way that it should be, because that's the way that it was for a long time. That's the way the nationalists might, articulate the situation. The strength of the Confederacy allowed Catalonia to expand that Mediterranean influence until the mid 14th century. And during this time, Catalan cultural influence also spreads. So the language spreads from place to place. And for example, the Balearic Islands are still, Catalan speaking. And Catalan poetry is something that's becomes kind of a mark of what's going on from place to place. And the reason I mentioned that is because that's going to be harkened back to in the contemporary era, this thing, and particularly in the beginning of the modern era, that's going to be another important part of our stories.
That's interesting, because to me, once a language starts to become the cultural language, right? It's used in sort of, writings, and I guess in this case, poetry. That's the point where it feels like it's going to start. Well, taking over is maybe the wrong word, but becoming the dominant language, right?
Yeah, that's right. And the poetry sometimes evokes what today we would call nationalistic feelings. And things.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that it references a particular place and lauds a particular place, and it ties any place where that ties that language to that place.
Right.
So at the same time, though, that this is all going on, and as we mentioned in the Spanish language episode, Castile grew into a powerful kingdom at the center of the Iberian Peninsula. Castile absorbed the kingdoms of Leon, Cordoba, Seville under Ferdinand II. And in the first half of the 13th century, this marks a trend of Castilian expansion that eventually dominated the Iberian Peninsula. We talk about the Reconquista and taking over from Muslim people who had ruled a lot of the Iberian Peninsula for many years. And the Reconquista took hundreds of years to realize. But in the context of all this that's happening, it was in 1359 that something called the Generalitat, which is the regional government of Catalonia, was established. And that's still what the regional government of Catalonia is called today. When it was reinstated after the Spanish Civil War, it's the Generalitat. So that provides this historical link that, this name is being used throughout time.
I'm sure very intentional.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Because language is important. And this is the terms that are used are important for connecting to the past and creating an idea of a people that has been around for a long time. So a few more things, and then we'll take, I think, our first break. But we want to talk about the joining of Aragon and Castile. And this is the big unification of Spain. Many people are probably familiar with. Beginning in the mid 14th century in Catalonia, there were economic crises due to poor harvests, population declines induced by the plague. And Catalonia is sent sort of into decline at this time, and the region's hold on the Mediterranean deteriorates. Social unrest leads to civil war in Catalonia beginning in 1462. And it was during this low point in Catalan affairs that Ferdinand, who is heir to the crown of Aragon, and Isabella, who is the heiress to the crown of Castile, they will get married. And then in 1479, they join together and form the Kingdom of Spain, which takes up most of the Iberian Peninsula. And so, but even then, for about 200 years or so, Catalonia is still largely autonomous. It's part of Spain, but it's still operating largely autonomously. And in 1640, there's in Catalonia, there's a revolt against the King of Spain, Philip IV. A republic is declared, and Catalonia effectively becomes part of France for a little while, like not quite 20 years, and then it's retaken by Spain.
It's funny because that specific line, that it became part of France for a brief period of time. So at one point on my YouTube channel, I tried to do this thing where I was going to track the geographic history of various places. Mm-hmm. Right? How did they grow and expand and contract and like get to where they're at today? And the first country I chose, which was probably a bad idea in hindsight, was France. Because as it turns out, tracking the boundaries, if they could even be called boundaries, the borders, what have you, of all of these places is it's just impossible. It's like they changed in such minute ways. There was like periods of time where for like 10 years they owned this thing or had sovereignty over this thing, but then it was, taken away from them somehow, or they sold it off, whatever. It's a madhouse. The territorial integrity of even places as established today as France.
Yeah, and France is known, it has a very strong national identity, I think, internally and externally, but France is made of a group of different groups of people. There are Catalans there are Bretons, there are Alsatians, numbers of different groups that today are identified as French. And the French state did a really good job of establishing this idea of a unified country where Parisian French eventually became the dominant form of French that was used. Other languages are still used, but everything is controlled through Paris. It's a very centralized country. And Spain kind of tried to do that too, but they didn't have the success that France did with it. And they weren't able to create the same kind of French identity, I think, that the Spanish state may have wanted to cast Castilian as the dominant ethnicity of the entire peninsula.
Mm-hmm.
How about we take a short break?
Ooh, let's do it. So we're going to hit our very first ad break. We'll come back. I think we're going to still do some history stuff. And then we'll, I guess, keep doing that. All right. We'll be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. Today we're talking about geography is Catalonia and Catalonia independence movement. And we're going through some history here, which we said is really important for understanding what's happening today. And the next moment that we want to visit here is in 1705, where there is a crisis in Spain because the death of Charles II in 1700, he has no heirs. And so there's debate and who should lead the country, who should be king of Spain, in other words. This provides Catalonia with an opportunity to try to assert some of its autonomy. And fearing Bourbon-style absolutist rule, Catalonia backs Archduke Charles of Austria, who is opposed to the Bourbon claimant Philip V. And the Catalans sought thus not only autonomy, but a hand in determining who would claim power in Spain. And this is interesting for the contemporary period because Catalonia has, since the end of the Spanish Civil War, has often been an important power broker in the national scene in Spain as well. But Philip emerges victorious, so not the ones that they were supporting, and they punished the Catalans severely for their disloyalty. It's funny. I feel like in one sort of small section of this podcast, we ran through sort of the intricacies of the different royalties of Europe and how they interacted, because as you were just talking about it, obviously there's this, person, Philip who was trying to, maintain control over Spain. I don't know where exactly he was from. But there was also this person, Archduke Charles of Austria, and Austria is not super duper close to by European standards, it's not close. Exactly. Global standards, obviously they're pretty close, but especially given the time, right? This isn't like you're not going to take a flight from, wherever, Salzburg to Madrid or something like that and be there in a couple hours, right? It's just amazing thinking about that there's this other royalty, this royal entity that's, hundreds of miles away, that is able to at least have some sort of say in, hey, maybe this should be mine instead. Yeah, there's all these examples, right, in European history and probably in other places throughout the world of places controlling others from far away because they were royalty, basically, and because the different royal families got together and said, well, this is the way that we can maintain our powers by recognizing each other's power. And of course, there were lots of wars fought between these areas as well. Maybe someday we'll talk about the Treaty of Westphalia, which really sets in motion the kind of state system that we have today. But that's not today. So after the War of Spanish Succession, King Philip bans most Catalan institutions. their laws, their customs. It denies them their language and imposes a centralized rule over the area. And this was done through the Decree of Nueva Planta in 1716, which destroys Catalan autonomy and then truly integrates the region into the Spanish state through the dismantling of all the political institutions, imposing heavy taxes, enforcing Castilian laws, occupying the region with troops, and then also instituting Castilian as the language of administration. So, this is not the last time we're going to see a move like this happen in Spain, but this is what sets Catalonia as part of Spain and without autonomy for a while.
Right. I mean, to me, this feels like they're really trying to erase the identity of Catalonia, right?
That's exactly what's going on. And again, like France kind of was more successful at doing with lots of other regions in France. Not that they were completely eliminated, but that was the endeavor. And that's the idea of state building, right? The idea of creating a central state where the laws apply all over the place, and there's a language and a religion that applies all over the place. And that's how control is established and exercised. So this marks the emergence of the centralized Spanish state and a concerted effort by the state leaders in Madrid to define that which was the Spanish as that which was Castilian. So that's what I was talking about, and that's the sort of the ethnicity that gets brought up as well, this is how we should identify at the expense of other identities. Castile begins to impose its culture on Catalonia in an attempt to assimilate the Catalan people into a uniform political and cultural identity. And this is being done also to avoid future uprisings. And this is the way that states operate. And if you conquer an area and you can get that area to identify with the conquering power, then there might be less chance of a revolution happening. Now in 1812, Napoleon decrees Catalonia to be part of France. So this is part of what you were struggling with when you did your YouTube episode, I think.
Yeah.
Because he made all kinds of decrees, but this lasted for about 2 years. So this wasn't long lasting. And then we get into the 1800s, and there's a few things that we want to highlight about the 1800s that's happening on the Iberian Peninsula and Catalonia. And one is the Industrial Revolution, right? Because we talked
generally
about that.
Happening, everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but
it starts to spread, right? Mm-hmm. It starts to spread from England, the Midlands of England, to other areas, and it gets to the Iberian Peninsula first in the Basque Country and in Catalonia. So those are the first parts of Spain to industrialize, and so those areas become pretty wealthy through that industrialization as well. And there was also a cultural renaissance that was happening at the time in Catalonia, the Renaixença, it's called in Catalan. And this was a surge in interest in various Catalan art forms, including poetry, theater, architecture, painting, sculpture. These are the elements of culture that distinguish one group from another, right? And so, and the very term Renaissance is like rebirth, right? It denotes a rebirth of something that had lived before but lies dormant. So the idea of recapturing a previous era of power or grandeur or something like that.
Which feels particularly apt for Catalonia right now, right? They'd gone through this period where the Spanish king had tried to erase all of their identity, their language, everything like that. And I think, perhaps not surprising they wanted that back.
That's right.
They wanted that identity back.
That's right. And it's interesting that the pushback initially happens in a cultural way, because the political parties and political movements will form from that cultural sort of reawakening, that Renaissance that's going on. And so it was during this Renaissance that there were lots of efforts to evoke this sort of glorious golden age of Catalonia in the medieval time, when there was an extensive, territories throughout the Mediterranean, and it was really more of a Mediterranean place instead of a Spanish place. It was a European or a Mediterranean place. And so one of the things that happens is this resurrecting of these poetry contests. I don't know if it's like a poetry slam, or I'm not exactly sure how they did that, but they're called the Jeux Floraux, or the floral games. And at this time, they become very explicitly tied to this idea of Catalan identity, right? And so through this art form, through poetry, there's almost all what we would read as sort of nationalistic type things happening at the time in a lot of the poetry, and then some of the leaders of that movement start to look towards a political movement at this time as well. So these two are connected.
I think given the context of sort of maybe what I'm envisioning for these Jacques Florals is definitely, absolutely 100% now a poetry slam.
Right. I mean, whether that's true or not, let's just think about it this way, because that puts it in terms that we can sort of understand. But what is a poetry slam is a way of declaring who you are. It's a way of setting forth the truth about somebody, about oneself, oftentimes, somebody's own truth, somebody's own reality. And so in a sense, maybe they are pretty similar.
Yeah, totally.
So the version of Catalan identity that's promoted through the Renaissance has been characterized by several scholars as traditionalist, inward looking, and wary of change. So it's really based on a sort of rural ideal. And we see this in lots of independence movements as well. And more conservative notions of a national image based on these rural identities. And there's a sort of a reluctance to fall under the manipulation or the influence of urban elites. And so the role of Barcelona is interesting to consider here, because as we get into the 20th century, the ways in which Catalan identity is constructed is sometimes constructed along this sort of rural and urban divide. And the role of Barcelona figures pretty prominently at times in which particular view of Catalonia is promoted. In Catalonia, the rural intelligentsia participated strongly in the Renaissance, and that's one of the ways in which these traditions were promoted. But the Renaissance itself started in Barcelona. So there is a tension between these things, the sort of rural and urban. And when I say urban in case of Barcelona, there's a real outlook towards the rest of Europe and the Mediterranean instead of an internal look towards just the region or just Spain. And so this is going to characterize some of the things that develops from that point on. We talked, the Industrial Revolution played a big role at that point. You know, if you've been to Barcelona, and it's the part that's the sort of small, intimate streets and everything. The Ras Ramblas runs through that, and the old Gothic corridor, Gothic neighborhood, and these kinds of things. That's the old city that used to be walled, and the city became too big to maintain all that, because the population went from about 100,000 people in 1800 to about 337,000 people in 1877. So huge growth. And so they had to tear down those medieval walls and create an extension, and that's what they call it, the extension to the city, which is that grid-like part of Barcelona that we were talking about at the top of the episode.
Right. I feel like that's, I mean, not in the same way, obviously, but a lot of European cities feel like they've had something similar go on, right? At some point, this city was let's say a castle of some sort, maybe some sort of fortification. It was built, with walls around it for the obvious need for protection from other, maybe, counts or, whatever areas. And at some point they grow and there's just no more space for them, especially given the technology at the time. There weren't skyscrapers going up, in, the 1500s or whatever, whenever this process might have happened. So this doesn't surprise me at all.
Well, and then there's one city in particular that's very influential in how European cities changed from their medieval layout to a more modern layout. Do you know which city I might be talking about?
I don't. I mean, London?
Paris.
Paris, really?
That's right.
I would not have guessed Paris. I would have actually explicitly not said Paris was not going to be the one. I almost said that, actually. That would
Well,
have
there
been
was the
embarrassing.
Haussmanization of Paris. This is the idea that this one influential individual who designed the Champs-Élysées and these grand
Mm,
boulevards as an exercise of both state power, and mobilizing troops and creating the idea of a modern place. And
mm,
so if you look at the Eixample, the extension in Barcelona, you see the same kind of thing. These very big diagonal streets. One of them is called Diagonal. And this marks the sort of beginning of the modern urban era in Barcelona and Catalonia, and in different parts of Europe as well. And so these rural bourgeoisie who settled in this new part of Barcelona were often wealthy textile merchants. So that was the industry that started the Industrial Revolution in England, and it started the Industrial Revolution took root in Catalonia through textiles as well. And so there was this new part of the city was kind of a blank slate, right, in which to kind of showcase what this new emerging Catalonia was. And so a lot of artists were hired to create these distinct form of architecture that you were talking about. That's one of the reasons that Barcelona is known for its architecture, is this period called Modernisme, which was kind of a take on Art Nouveau, which was called different things in different parts of Europe, and it was called Modernisme in Catalonia. And so you have artists, architects like Luis Domènech i Montaner, Josep Puig de Calfal, and Antoni Gaudi, who is probably the best. It's not the best example of modernism, but is probably the best well-known architect anywhere.
that's
Maybe
the one I've heard of. Yeah.
right. And so, if you think about what the Medicis did, back in the day in what's now northern Italy, creating this grandeur on the landscape to illustrate that this is who we are. And that kind of thing was happening at the time in Barcelona through this modernist architecture. And there's a key to sort of turning away from Spanishness and turning towards something distinctly Catalan during this period of architecture. So that becomes part of this movement that's happening with the Renaissance as well. The modernists were emphasizing an openness towards Europe, right? So it was more of a cosmopolitan and sort of turning their back on this idea of Spanishness at the time. So and also at this time, Modernisme starts to create this divide between the more traditional conservative rural view of Catalonia and the more urban European looking view of Catalonia. So this divide starts to amplify, I think, during this time. And the art movement isn't the cause of it, but is an expression of it, and is dialectically connected to the way that things play out politically as well.
It is interesting, like seeing this, what's that saying, that history is a flat circle or something like that. But the idea like that everything you're sort of talking about now within the context of Catalan, you sort of see even today, right? There's the urban rural divide, around the world, states and countries and what have you everywhere. And even though the urban and rural sort of areas could be ideologically on the same side, how they go about it, could be wildly different. Right.
And ideologically, they might be different as well. But I think, as you're suggesting, in many places throughout the world, it's the rural scene that's held up as the heart of a particular group of people in a country or a nation. And so that we see that time and time again, all over the world. Right.
Fascinating.
So the modern political Catalan nationalist movement really begins to take form in the late 1880s. There is a manifesto published called Lo Catalanisme in 1886, which sort of is a manifesto of Catalan political aspirations. And then we get in 1901, Enric Prat de la Riba leads the formation of La Liga Regionalista, which became the dominant Catalan nationalist party through the 1920s. And that vision for Catalonia was published in 1906 under the title La Nacionalitat Catalana, the Catalan nationality. Right? So we get this idea of nationhood and nationality, and the idea is to realize that under the modern state system, you need a territory which you control in order to do that.
Right.
So
this would have been like right around the time that League of Nations was starting to become a thing, right? Which is sort of that weird precursor to the United Nations, right?
It was just before that, around that time, right? The League of Nations, the idea that, which again, it's an interesting thing because the United Nations or League of Nations says that this is a group of different nations, but nations aren't really represented in the United Nations. Right. It's states or countries that are represented.
That's true.
It's kind of a misnomer. Yeah. Catalanismo becomes this term that's used for advancing political, economic, social, cultural interests of Catalonia. But there are many Catalanista parties, political parties. So it's not just one group. And we find this in independence movements all over the place too. There's different factions who have different ideas about how to realize more autonomy or independence. But what they have in common is that they believe that their people should have a place that they get to rule. And how to get there and how that should look afterwards is what differs a lot. And so the language, again, becomes more increasingly important at this time as a venue for the expression of a separate identity. And I'll only mention this shortly, but it was at this critical time in the early development of modern political nationalism that FC Barcelona was formed in 1899.
That might actually explain a lot, because FC Barcelona, in my head, was so tied to Catalan and sort of establishing it as a place, as a people, as an identity. And it would be interesting to think of what FC Barcelona might look like today had it been established during some other period when maybe this wasn't as prominent in its birth and founding, you know? Maybe it would be more neutral, for lack of a better term.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because I did a large thought experiment in this called my doctoral dissertation, which I wrote about the ways in which FC Barcelona functions as a vehicle for the expression of urban identity in Barcelona, national identity in Catalonia, but still it was being branded and marketed as a global brand as well. Mm-hmm. So that's why I know a few things about this, and I don't claim to be a huge expert, but I spent years studying this way back in the day. And what I wanted to illustrate was how an aspect of culture, popular culture, in this case, a soccer team, a football team, can be an important touchstone and venue for the expression of a separate identity. And that's what FC Barcelona really did for people, not everybody in Catalonia, but at a time when there was incredible repression during the dictatorship that followed the Spanish Civil War, this was one of the few ways in which people could express this identity that had been sort of taken away from them or had been banned. So let's get deeper into the 20th century. There's two periods of dictatorship that happened in Spain. And the first one was a shorter one in the 1920s. So this was a military coup led by Miguel Primo de Rivera. Harsh regional repression in Catalonia followed. The governing authority, so the Generalitat, was abolished. Political and cultural institutions were suppressed. The Catalan flag was banned. Education policy was centralized in Madrid, so the language instruction had to be taught in Castilian, not in Catalan. And there was this persecution of all the fundamental symbols of Catalan identity that was going on.
Right. I guess the most fundamental Catalan identity I can think of is the flag, which is it's the stripes, the red and sort of an orangey yellow. I don't know exactly what color it is.
Call it yellow. Yeah.
Okay. Yellow. Or a red and yellow flag, right? That seems very Catalonian to me. And I'm imagining at this point, I don't know if that was the same flag. I don't know if it's changed.
Well, that is the flag, but there's another version of that flag with the same colors that's configured a little bit differently, which explicitly speaks to independence. But even the Catalan flag would be seen as a symbol of the nation and the desire to be autonomous. So this period of dictatorship comes to an end in 1930. In 1931, a Spanish Republic is established. So under the 1931 autonomy statute, Catalonia regains many of its political, financial, economic, political, linguistic rights. But this was a short ride, right? This is short-lived because in 1936, a Spanish garrison under the control of a general named Francisco Franco revolted against the Republic, precipitating the start of a civil war in Spain. And this is the civil war that's from 1936, the end of 36 into 1939, that completely transforms Spain once again under a dictatorship. And that dictator was Franco. And a note that when you're in Catalonia, you don't use that name much. People don't say that name. When they want to refer to that period of time of the dictatorship, they call it often the old regime. And so that's a name that still carries an enormous amount of political charge and baggage. And it was, I had to learn this, but I realized, all right, now this is something that I need to attune myself to if I want to function in among Catalan people, that this is you refer to this as the ancient regime.
It's interesting as we're talking about this, because so much of at least the history that we're taught here in the United States, and I'm sure Canada, I'm sure, to be honest, I'm sure most of Europe during this time, they're mostly focused on, well, at the time, which was brewing here in the United States, was already actively starting to happen in Europe, but that is the World War II, the beginnings of it anyways, right?
Right.
Everything gets couched in sort of that history, that geography, that all of that kind of sort of those events that are unfolding. In Spain, well, not entirely separated from it. There was definitely some involvement by different powers in that civil war. Does almost feel like it's sitting outside of that entire event because of its civil war, which is, again, within our history, our classes and everything, just not really talked about much at all, if at all. So it's very interesting, like learning about it, being like, wow, that was actually a really big deal for Spain, for a significant part of Europe.
Well, and then Spain is pretty isolated during the period that follows the Spanish Civil War, right? By much of the international community. If we want to go back, we can look at the rise of Mussolini in Italy. That gives sort of a model that was followed by the Falange or the Falante in Spain. And this is the political party that's formed from a couple different political parties, which is akin to fascism. And what is fascism? It's a political system that has absolute rule by a dictator, where citizens cannot oppose or even voice opposition to the ruler. And then the social order is usually based on one particular ethnic identity. And we see this, there's several occasions of this happening in Europe where the leader isn't even part of that cultural group, right? So Franco was not Castilian, he was Galician. In the same way that Adolf Hitler wasn't German, he was Austrian.
Right.
And that Joseph Stalin was not Russian, he was Georgian. And so it's interesting, these moments that it's politically expedient to choose what is perceived to be the dominant group to get support and to establish a state that is based on the language and traditions of this one particular group at the expense of all the others. And so that's kind of a shorthand for what fascism presents to a place. As a quick aside, since we're talking about the Spanish Civil War, did you know that in late 1936, George Orwell traveled to Barcelona to join the fight against the Falange?
I did, but only because I can't remember if it was our English language episode or our Spanish language episode, but we talked a little bit about this.
I'm mentioning it again, right? So I'm a little bit of a shill for George Orwell sometimes. But yeah, he went and he fought in that war, was shot, almost killed. He wrote and then subsequently published a book called Homage de Catalonia in 1948, which talks about just the chaos of the war and the conflicts that was happening internally in Barcelona and throughout the region. For people who are not hip to George Orwell, you might remember that he wrote Animal Farm, which was published in 1945, or more famously still, the novel 1984, which was published in 1949, probably written mostly in 1948. I'm guessing maybe he's like, well, this is clever. I can just switch the dates and we'll talk about this distant time in the future that we'll probably never get to. And George Orwell was his pen name, right?
I did not know that. No.
Yeah. His given name is Eric Arthur Blair.
I have never heard that before.
So I think Orwell, like we have this term Orwellian,
right,
which Blair doesn't lend itself to as well, like Blairian or something. I don't know how we would do that. So Orwellian, that's a made up name that has now become integrated into different countries and in languages of different countries like ours. I think it's time for a break.
Yeah, I think so. I think we need to do a quick break and get a little bit of just get a breather. So we will be right back.
And we're back. It's the Geography is Everything podcast. We're talking about geography as a Catalonian independence movement. And we've been talking about the Spanish Civil War and how impactful that was for the Iberian Peninsula and for Europe and the world in some ways. A fascist government is installed in Spain, and the dictator seeks to forge a dominant Spanish identity centered on Castilian culture, as we mentioned before the break. And with this regime came an effort to centralize every element of Spanish society. And of this vociferous campaign at eradicating any vestige of regionalism or other nations, like in Galicia, like in the Basque Country, like in Catalonia, and denying the cultural symbols and institutions. Of course, a lot of people have subsequently theorized that this repression only made those identities push back even stronger and may have sort of, in reaction to that repression, strengthened in some ways those identities in face of the centralized Spanish state.
Right. I mean, to me, that makes sense. I think, I'm sure there's an example of this happening, but when you actively try and sort of, squash something like that, it's there. I think there's a natural part of humans that's like, well, no, we're going to, this thing I didn't care about before. Yeah.
I'm going to double down.
I'm going to double down. Yeah. No, I'm going to throw it back in your face as soon as I get a chance.
That's right.
Whereas if you just sort of let things phase out on their own, then maybe then that absolutely does happen, right? There are identities that just sort of phase out, and that's
right.
They just don't ever really get brought up again, or maybe very small
that's right.
identities. Yeah.
Right. That start to, or eventually in some cases, disappear entirely. We've lost thousands of languages on the planet, for example, through these kinds of processes.
Yep, totally.
So during this period of dictatorship, the Generalitat, the regional government, is eliminated. Use of the Catalan language in all forms is strictly forbidden. So no publishing, no educating in Catalan. The university courses and educational materials do away with any aspect of Catalan culture. Education is centralized. And almost 4,000 people or maybe more were executed for disloyalty to the regime. So there was many people who paid for their commitment to Catalonia with their lives. Exhibition of Catalan flags, monuments, and music was forbidden. There's a dance called the Sardana, which is famous in Catalonia and has become emblematic of Catalan identity because it was banned during the dictatorship. And the idea was to completely suffocate and eradicate these other cultures and these other languages from the Spanish state. And now during the 1950s and the 1960s, Catalonia attracts a large number of immigrants from southern Spain and other parts of Spain, notably Andalusia, because there's a lot of job opportunities, there's a lot of business opportunities there. And so this influx of immigrants really starts to force some new thinking about how Catalan identities is constructed. And I think this also emphasizes, hey, if you come here and you move here and you want to speak Catalan, then you are identifying with us. And that's what it means to be Catalan, is to speak this language. So, the degree to which people adopted that language probably had a lot to do with their sense of belonging or how they might have been treated. And again, I wasn't alive during that time. I didn't know exactly how that played out, but this is what I understand. There are people who were alive during that time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there are a lot of people who lived through this period, and these are the people who'd be able to tell us exactly what happened. But in the early 1970s, the power of the dictatorship starts to fade. The dictator becomes ill, and the pushing back is having a little bit more of a success. And then in 1975, Franco died. And that was on November 20th. And 2 days later, the monarchy is restored. Juan Carlos was crowned King of Spain, and democratic reforms are undertaken. And in 1978, a new constitution is approved, and it grants limited authority to the three officially recognized historic autonomous communities: Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia. And later, all the regions of Spain would be invested with these limited autonomies. Catalonia was the first part of Spain to be granted regional self-government. And in 1979, the Statute of Autonomy for Catalonia was passed, approved by a referendum yielding an 88% yes vote in Catalonia. This reestablishes the autonomy of Catalonia. The Generalitat is reinstituted. The Catalan language becomes an official language of Spain. Like, it is listed as a language of Spain, so it's a Spanish language. Deal. It's a big deal. Right?
That's a really big deal. I mean, there was this is sort of a little bit of an aside, but it sort of brings into, I think, how big of a deal having it as an official language is. I vaguely recall that when the European Union was first sort of became a thing, an entity that was beyond just the economic aspect of it, that each country that was a part of it could submit a language that would be representative of their place, right? And, obviously a lot of countries picked sort of, France picked French, Germany picked German, all that kind of stuff. And I remember, the UK picked English for the obvious reason that they spoke English there predominantly. And Ireland picked Irish Gaelic, even though Irish Gaelic at the time was not, and it still isn't the dominant language within the Republic of Ireland. But there's a lot of pride that gets built into that. And the idea of it becoming the official language somewhere, especially somewhere above and beyond your own sort of country, I think is putting forward an identity that is very powerful. And so I think maybe in some of the same ways for Catalan to become an official language within Spain is like, hey, this is an actual identity that is now recognized in a way that probably was never really recognized, and at any time when Spain was an entity.
You're making a great point about also the European Union and the languages that are spoken there. I think Irish Gaelic was adopted not initially, but eventually. I mean, Ireland wasn't one of the initial founders of what was the precursor to the European Economic Community and the EU. But at the time that I was doing my research for my dissertation in Barcelona, which is a long time ago now, 20 years, there was a lot of campaigning of politicians for Catalan to be recognized as a European language by the European Parliament. And the idea was, well, if we can't get the kind of recognition we want in Spain, we can get European recognition, and that would be important. And so you're absolutely right that that's a super important venue for the recognition of separate identities as well. So let's get into 1980s, which is starting to feel a little bit more recent, right?
A little bit.
The president of the Generalitat from 1980 to 2003 was the same guy. His name was Jordi Pujol. Jordi, incidentally, is George, the equivalent of George in Catalan. And George is not only the patron saint of England, but the patron saint of Catalonia. And so if you go to Catalonia, you might meet some people named Jordi. That's pretty likely, right? Because that's an important thing. And during the dictatorship, you weren't allowed to use Catalan names. Like, you weren't legally permitted to do that. And so the use of Catalan names, and even now is a recapturing of what was denied during the dictatorship. So Jordi Pujol is member of a national coalition party called Convergence and Union is the way we would say it in English. And his view of Catalan identity in Catalonia starts to become the dominant force in structuring the ways that Catalonia and Barcelona are often understood and socially constructed. And this was a very sort of one that evoked the rural conservative kind of tropes of Catalonia, which was in sort of opposition to the way that many socialists, for example, Pasqual Maragall, who was the mayor of Barcelona from 82 to 97 and subsequently became the president of the Generalitat in 2004, which emphasized the role of Barcelona and the role of openness towards Europe and these kinds of things. So we have these different views of Catalanismo or Catalanist national parties that in some ways, not exclusively, fall under this sort of emphasis on the rural and the urban. Now in 1992, it's important to mention that the Summer Olympics were held in Barcelona.
That would have been a big deal. Yeah.
Right. And as you know, that they're awarded like further advanced than they used to be, but this would have been in the late 80s. This was awarded to Barcelona, and the city starts to change in a major way. Huge capital investment. Entire parts of the city are rebuilt and reimagined. But it's also this time where people in Catalonia and politicians in Catalonia can start to promote to the wider world that Catalonia is a thing, that it should be an independent place of the world. And in fact, the Catalan regional government took out a full-page ad in the New York Times.
Wow.
And it posed the question, where is Barcelona? And then it rhetorically answered the question, it's a city in the country of Catalonia. And so this cultural phenomenon of the Olympics was a venue for expressing the idea that, hey, world, we're really not part of Spain. This is Catalonia. This is what's going on. This is what you should be thinking about.
It's fascinating, the geopolitical and geocultural aspects of taking that article out in the New York Times to basically push that message is layered. Right? I guess the prominence at the time, and New York Times still has a lot of prominence, I'm not saying it, but the prominence of a physical New York Times paper during that moment was probably the highest it ever was, right? And that was probably a way to sort of say, hey, like this, we are our own thing, to get it to that idea to as the most amount of people as possible.
You know, and I think there's something else on top of that, which is that for a government to advertise their nationality to another group of people is a very different thing than negotiating with another state, with another country itself, right? And so this is sometimes called public diplomacy, the idea that you're trying to, win the hearts and minds of another group of people. In this case, through advertising the New York Times.
Right.
So moving forward here, I mentioned that Maragall became president of the Generalitat in 2004. In 2006, it was a big year. Catalonia's autonomy statute went into effect, which gave the regional government increased political power and increased control over finances. And that control over finances has been a big political point of contention. And then Catalonia is referred to in this document as a nation, which is a huge moment. Right. Because that suggests, because if you suggest there's a nation, then well, maybe a nation should have a country of their own. However, in 2010, this gets rolled back. The Spanish Constitutional Court in Madrid dismisses part of that autonomy statute, and in doing so also denies this idea that Catalonia should be referred to as a nation. And so the central government starts to put their foot down, and we start to see some tension rising. Also in 2010, and this is another cultural thing that I'll mention, bullfighting is outlawed in Catalonia by the regional government.
Right. Oh, I hadn't heard that, but I do know that bullfighting is a very Castilian Spanish sort of thing, very Madrid almost, at least in my head. Culturally, Madrid. Yeah.
It may be Andalusian. I'm not sure if it's Castilian or Andalusian, but in any case, it becomes conflated with the central power in Castile and becomes conflated with Spanishness. I lived in Barcelona before bullfighting was outlawed, and I lived for a couple months. I lived across the street from the El Monumental, which is where the bullfights happened. And I never went to see one because I was I wasn't sure I wanted to get in on that kind of situation. But there were constantly protests, particularly by animal rights activists, and that there was graffiti on the walls that spoke to that and all this kind of stuff. So, what this does is it highlights the importance of cultural politics and sort of pushing political ideas. In 2010, the Convergence and Union Party takes back power with Artur Mas taking over. And he forms a pact in 2012 with Esquerra Republicana, the Republican left, which is a left-wing party. So this is a parliamentary system where if you don't have a majority, you have to join up with other parties so that you can form a government that functions. It's a bit different than what we have going on in the United States. In 2013, Catalonia's regional parliament decides that it wants to approve a declaration of sovereignty, which calls for a referendum on independence, which would be held in 2014. But early in 2014, Spain's constitutional court says that this referendum is unconstitutional. And the Spanish state says this was illegal. They're not impressed. You can't do this. But so the Catalan regional government, they held a vote anyways, but they called it a non-binding vote. So it wasn't, they tried to get around that by saying, well, this isn't binding. We're just trying to get a sense what people think. And 80% of those who participated in that particular referendum in Catalonia supported independence and separation from Spain. And so the Generalitat, and the politicians and the separatist parties, they start to interpret this as a mandate to pursue independence. A resolution for independence is adopted, but is denied once again by the Spanish Constitutional Court. And in 2016, a really important individual for the most recent stuff that's gone on, Carles Puigdemont, is chosen by the regional assembly to serve as the president of the regional government. So people don't elect the president; they elect the officers, in the regional body who will elect the person who will be the leader. So it's again a little bit different than what people in the United States, if you're listening from the United States, what you might be used from. And so in June 2017, Puigdemont announces a referendum on independence will be held. And the prime minister of Spain, who's from the very conservative right-wing party, the Partido Popular, his name is Mariano Rajoy, vows to stop the referendum from happening. And so this is slated for October 1st. And there's a huge conflict because the referendum is being held and the Spanish state declares the vote illegal and sends in the national police and the civil guard in order to stop voting. And the Catalan police largely stand down. They're not getting in the way of what's going on. But in places, the civil guard and the national police clash violently with voters. And sometimes, there are all these violent images of people in riot gear beating people who are trying to, participate democratically in this, although Spain said it was illegal. And, people who are elderly, for example, trying to vote and getting knocked down. And so, I think the idea from the view of Catalonia is that the world is going to see this and they're going to be shocked. And I think the world was shocked, but there was no political support that necessarily followed from that. And so the referendum, which had 43% of eligible voters. So the perception is people who didn't think that this was a good idea, they just didn't vote. But 92% of those who did vote voted for independence. So, but again, under 50% of the people voted. And the regional government of Catalonia decides that they're going to declare independence. So October 27th. And I remember when this happened because, following this situation based on having researched this area and lived in this area. And I was thinking, well, this is going to be the day. October 27th is going to be Independence Day for this part of the world, for this place. However, the Spanish government immediately took over administration of Catalonia and disbarred the regional government from existing and imposed direct rule. So Rajoy imposed direct rule over Catalonia and dismissed Puigdemont and the regional parliament. And so at this point, Puigdemont flees Catalonia and Spain, and he goes to exile. Would it be fun to guess where he went for you? It's in Europe. I'll give you a hint.
Yeah, I guess where I was going to say was going to be, probably, I don't know. I mean, I would say Portugal just because it's close by, but maybe France also. France, actually, probably France. France makes the most sense to me. Or
France is
Italy.
a pretty
Or
good
Corsica.
guess, right? It turns out to be Belgium,
Okay.
which is a
Well, that's
country
where the
that
EU is located.
may split into two different countries at one point, right?
Yeah.
So he takes up residence in Waterloo, which is, I think, a very strange irony that he would move to Waterloo.
Yes.
And he has been consistently able to ward off extradition to Spain. He was arrested in Germany at one point, but they didn't send him back to Spain. He was arrested in Italy at one point. So he's moving around a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to Ireland to give talks that are well received to people who want independence, that want in Northern Irish independence from the UK. And then in 2019, he was elected to the European Parliament. So he's actually an active politician again. I think he's still living in Waterloo. I don't think he's been able to go back. And a few other Catalan officials also fled to Belgium at the time, but a few of them that were left behind were arrested, tried, and found guilty of sedition, I think, which is a lesser charge than the rebellion. A charge of rebellion could get you up to 25 years in prison. And so these people who were found guilty were sentenced between 8 and 13 years in prison.
It's interesting thinking about Carlos being a European Parliament politician, because and maybe this is, I just don't have that much of a knowledge of the European Parliament, EU Parliament, but I would assume like maybe similar how, each US state has a certain amount of representatives based on population, but you still have to be elected within sort of your state, right? I assume that it would be something similar, right? Spain gets 10 members of parliament, and people in Spain vote on them based on whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I've heard the European Parliament referred to is the Europe of regions, really. So more than the Europe of states or something. And so different regions get to elect somebody to the European Parliament. And so a lot of times, and not just in Catalonia, but in other places in Europe where there are people who want to realize autonomous or independence for their group, have had more success in electing people to the European Parliament than to their own national parliaments. This isn't a hard, fast rule, but this was the case at one point. I don't know if that still follows suit. But at the time that I was doing a lot of research on this stuff, that was definitely the case. And this suggests that maybe some of that is still happening, that there is a venue for the expression of autonomy and independence that is afforded to separatists on the European stage. It's not afforded to them on their state and country stages. I will say that in 2021, which is, we're now talking recently, the Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, who was the Prime Minister since 2018, pardoned the imprisoned Catalan leaders. And this was controversial. Sanchez and his socialist party that he's a part of, we're starting to take a more conciliatory tone towards Catalonia and calls for a dialogue. There's now, I should mention, there's a Catalan Socialist Party and there's a National Catalan Socialist Party, and there can be at loggerheads, they can be at odds. They're not the same party. But this was an overture by the Prime Minister of Spain to say, hey, we need to move on from this. And it's in, what his rhetoric was, it's in the spirit of Spain to have an open exchange of ideas and these kinds of things. This is what a democratic Spain means. And again, there were different people in different parts of the countries who didn't agree with that. And then I'm sort of wrapping up a little bit, but I will say that the Generalitat, the regional government, conducts polls every year about how many people in Catalonia, this is a poll, so it's not like they've asked everybody, who supports independence. And in 2023, it was found that 52% of Catalans opposed independence and 43% supported it. So the numbers shifted in the years prior when there was, 50% or more who may have supported independence. And according to the Generalitat's own polls, something conducted last year, that may have shifted. Now, whether that's accurate or not, of course, polls are not always accurate, but it suggests that there is a lot of contention today as to how to move forward with this and whether increased autonomy is enough or whether independence is something that should be adopted. And of course, there are many people who feel one way and many people who feel the other way. I don't know what the actual percentages, nobody would know what the actual percentages are, but this is where the story's at right now, which is flux. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. I guess like, again, those polls might be indicative or may not be indicative of what's actually out there. But, as you were saying, it doesn't surprise me given sort of maybe the tonal shift from the central government of Spain, right? I think we established pretty early on in our episode when we were talking about the idea of trying to crush, or stamp out this identity entirely, and how oftentimes that just doesn't work. In fact, it tends to do the opposite, right? It tends to, maybe it's crushed for a little bit, but eventually that identity will flower again and, maybe spread quite a bit farther. Whereas if you make overtures to say, hey, let's try and do this and, maybe work in your identity in these different ways, that maybe the actual desire for full-blown independence isn't quite as strong amongst, a large part of the population that just kind of wants more recognition, right? They don't necessarily need us to be, our own passport having, currency wielding country. We just want to be recognized as Catalonians within, another entity, and that's fine with them. I can totally see that.
And to have a lot of control over political decisions and economic decisions and these kinds of things. I mean, you can imagine all kinds of reactions to this. Like, for example, somebody might be saying, hey, that's good. We want to be a part of a Spain where we have a lot of political power and often determining who the ruling party is in Madrid and all this kind of stuff. But you could also imagine the reaction being like, well, this is to assimilate us. And this is actually watering down the way we were headed. And this will not allow us to realize, the full potential of a political independent country that we would like to have. So you can imagine all kinds of variations. It's probably not either or. There's probably a spectrum or a continuum of people who have opinions varying on those ideas.
It's also interesting, going back, a few years to this 2017 sort of referendum that was held as sort of in defiance of the Spanish state, that this was also around the same time that, not to get us off topic here, but this is also the same time that Scotland was sort of having their own referendum. And the way in which the Spanish central government and the United Kingdom central government went about it was markedly different. I'm not saying that, the central UK government was entirely supportive of it, but I don't remember and I don't recall seeing any sort of violent sort of stamping out of any sort of referendums being held or anything of that nature. And so, earlier on in the episode, we sort of talked about, well, how would it have been different had, Scotland actually voted yes? They narrowly voted no and to stay in the UK. Would the UK have actually been amenable to that? And, the question is sort of, well, we don't know. It didn't happen. But based on sort of the reaction by Spain versus the UK just in having the referendum, I'm like, well, I mean, maybe the UK would have actually figured out some sort of process for it. At the very least, they seem to be much more amenable. I don't know if that's the right word. It's fascinating, the difference, because these happened very close to each other.
Yeah. And you're right that the reaction was markedly different, right? In the case of Catalonia, I'll also say that I think after the violence and all those images that were going out, those videos that were going out around the world, I imagine that some people in Catalonia and some political leaders thought that people would support them politically. In other words, recognize their independence. And that didn't end up happening. I don't think there was a single country in the world that recognized Catalan independence after that referendum in 2017.
Right.
And, that sets a precedent, right? First of all, for a country to recognize the independence of place in another part of the world suggests that, if the United States did that, the Hawaiians might be thinking, Hawaiian separatists might be saying, great, well, let's go. We get to do this too. If you think it's such a good idea, then this is what we've been talking about. And so there's some of that going on. In the case of Kosovo, there's a sort of alignment based on like like those close to Serbia, right? Politically, like Russia, like they voted, they didn't like recognize Kosovo. They're not going to do that. But the United States and many of the U.S. allies, not all of them, but some of them, recognize Kosovo as an independent place. And so that's in this sort of in between thing where, you know, South Sudan has been recognized, I think, widely as an independent country. Kosovo is sort of part of the way there, but it's not clear what's going to happen there. But in Catalonia in 2017, none of that happened. And so that's also something that would need to happen for the international community to regard this one place as independent.
It honestly feels like if your whatever country your nation is trying to break away from, your country, your region's trying to break away from, isn't supportive of that, it doesn't seem like you have any real chance to get recognition on the United Nations sort of global stage. For I think exactly what you just said is that, you know, at the very beginning of this episode, you sort of ran through a very quick, pretty expansive, but not entirely, not at all complete list of countries that had separatist movements within them, and no country wants to start inviting that same, well, I guess for lack of a better word, none of them want to deal with that themselves, you know, and they certainly don't want to get to the stage where now other countries are voting on their separatist movement and whether their separatist movement gets to have legality and recognition on the global stage.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. And you know, there are, like in the case of Kosovo, other political alignment type things that might come into play. But yeah, states don't want to give up power generally.
Right. Generally. Yeah.
Or territory. Yeah.
Territory. Oh boy. Well, I think with that, Hunter, we've done Catalonia, a real solid episode here. It was really fun. You want to run through your whatnots?
Thanks, Jeff. I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I am co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, which Jeff contributed to. And I co-authored those with David Banas and a bunch of other contributors. And then I'm also co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything.
Yeah, thanks, Hunter. This is, I'm co-host here as well. The Geography is Everything podcast has been a very fun episode. I really enjoyed it. You might have noticed that you might be watching this on YouTube again. We are officially back on YouTube, where I'm trying to, I guess, make these a little bit more graphically pleasing, right? So instead of us just talking at you, there's now images and videos that sort of help illustrate some of the points that we're trying to make. They're not quite as advanced as my sort of YouTube videos that I make on my other channel, but I think they make it a little bit more of a dynamic watch, and hopefully we can continue growing our audience on YouTube as well as, you know, other places, you know, because you can still listen to this episode of basically on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you go.
Yeah, don't stop listening. We'll still try to describe things really well if we can.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is going to feed into sort of what our next episode is, which I'm going to get to in a minute. You can find me, like I just mentioned, here on YouTube as well. You can find me over at youtube.com/geography by Jeff, where I make other videos. Go find me there. You can also find us over on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com. If you want more geography, podcast lives there as well. I guess the last thing I'll say is that if you enjoyed watching this, you enjoyed listening to this, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever app you use. Please like and subscribe to us on YouTube. All of this really helps us sort of build the algorithmic rankings and sort of get more listeners so that we can build a better community and make everything better and higher production quality and all that fun stuff. I guess all that's to say is please go and do that. Next week, we have a really interesting episode that's going to be hard.
It's a different kind of episode. Yeah.
A different kind of episode. It's going to be all about map projections, which is, if you're not like a total wonky sort of geography person, all that's to say is a map projection is that thing that sort of distorts our world in various ways to give some form of representation of the globe.
Right. Because it turns out you can't represent a globe in 2 dimensions correctly.
It's impossible.
You can't do it.
Yeah. So I thought we've been thinking about this episode for quite a while. I kind of timed us coming back to YouTube with this episode because of the fact that it's going to be a visual heavy episode. Now, for those of you who are going to listen to this episode, we're going to try our dang best to describe maps as well as give you the clear name of what the map projection is, so you can go and look them up if you want to. It should be, I think we're gonna do an okay job. You can also watch on YouTube, where at the same time as I'm talking about things, we'll be throwing up sort of examples of these map projections. So it should be a really fun episode. I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited to get it done and over with and out of the way, because it is something that I think also lends itself to us tackling other episodes in a similar way. So it's kind of one of those episodes I see as sort of a archetype episode. And from that, we can sort of talk about other aspects of maps.
Yeah. So in short, there will be images, but if you still want to listen, it's going to be totally viable to be a listener, and
totally.
Things will make sense. So you get to choose, and you don't have to stop listening if that's the way you like to do this.
Totally. Yep. Absolutely. And so I think with that, we're at time. So we will, thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for listening.